Hello to everyone who's here. I'm Rael Khan. I'm the director of the USC Center for Mindfulness Science, the host of this Mindfulness Science keynote with Dr. Eric Garland, co-hosted by the Institute for Addiction Science here at USC. And I'm just going to give a couple minutes here for some additional folks to join before doing the formal introduction of Dr. Garland and getting the show on the road. And for those who are joining, please do mute yourself. If you can even unmute yourself, I don't know if you can, but just to make sure you know, feedback. Okay, so I think we are close enough to a forum. Go ahead and start speaking here. So three of us you may be able to see on the screen, myself, Rael Khan, George, who's co-hosting the meeting and is going to be helping out with kind of coordinating if there's questions and answers and making sure that we let everyone in who wants to join. And Dr. Eric Garland with the beautiful Alpine background. And just a few words about the Center for Mindfulness Science. We are a center here at USC established 2 years ago with funding from the Office for Research to establish a center of excellence in mindfulness science. And so it's a collaborative group of researchers here at USC who are devoted to really exploring the foundations of mindfulness from a scientific perspective, ways in which mindfulness intersect with human biology, well-being, clinical treatment, social realities, and the evolution of culture within humanity that we are all living through. So we are interested in and have faculty from many schools and departments interested in all these different levels and the way they intersect with each other. And today we are lucky to have one of the leaders in the scientific investigation of mindfulness, specifically as applied to a very important challenge in our modern world, that of addiction. And in particular, Dr. Garland has done a lot of work at opioid addiction, particular signature scourges of an American medicine, where Dr. Garland is a distinguished endowed chair in research and professor and associate dean for research at the University of Utah College of Social Work, the director of the Center on Mindfulness and Integrative Health Intervention Development. Dr. Garland also is the developer of an innovative mindfulness-based therapy about which we're going to hear today in detail. The therapy founded on insights derived from cognitive, affective, and neurobiological science called mindfulness-oriented recovery enhancement, or MORE. In addition, as principal investigator and or co-investigator, Dr. Garland has over 160 scientific publications and has received more than $50 million in research grants from the NIH, the Department of Defense, and other organizations to conduct translational research on biopsychosocial mechanisms implicated in addiction, emotion dysregulation, and chronic pain, including randomized controlled trials of the intervention he developed, mindfulness-oriented recovery enhancement, as a treatment for opioid misuse and addiction, as well as chronic pain. To complement his expertise in clinical research, Dr. Garland is a licensed psychotherapist with more than 15 years of clinical experience providing mind-body therapies for persons suffering from addictive behaviors, psychological disorders, and chronic pain. In 2019, he was appointed by the NIH Director, Dr. Francis Collins, to the NIH HEAL multidisciplinary working group comprised of national experts on pain and addiction research to help guide the $1.1 billion HEAL initiative aimed at using science to halt the opioid crisis. On a personal level, I've gotten to know Eric over the past 10 years or so through the contemplative science community, and he's a very warm, engaging person who really walks the walk, and a kind of a beacon for many of us on the younger end of the professor academic pathway, see how somebody in our generation can really thrive and succeed in mindfulness science. So with that background, I just want to thank you very much, Eric, for joining us, and I'm really looking forward to your talk today. We want to finish up by about 1:30. So after you're done, sometime in the 1 to 1:30 range, those of you who are here participating will have a chance to do some question and answers. And again, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rao. And I really appreciate Dr. Khan's invitation to present to you. And I have many colleagues at USC as well, and I certainly view you as a major powerhouse of mindfulness science. So you're pretty lucky that you're all together in such a beautiful place to work on this together. But so today it's my honor to present to you a body of research that I've been working on for the past decade towards the development of a mindfulness-based intervention to treat the comorbidity of addiction and chronic pain, and specifically focusing in on the opioid crisis, which was one of the most severe public health crises of our day before we got hit by COVID. So it's my pleasure to sort of shift your attention away from the big public health crisis in your face to the other public health crisis that is also still in our faces in spite of this awful virus. And as I talk to you about this treatment development process, the story that I tell you is going to be making the journey from hedonic pleasure to self-transcendent meaning. And you might think that's a pretty big leap, and it certainly is a big leap. So I'm going to do my best to stitch together the pathways linking hedonic pleasure to self-transcendent meaning for you. But bear with me, because I'm still in the process of understanding this myself and further developing this story, which really is been the work of my life. So to begin, let's talk about the opioid crisis. So in 2015, Nobel Prize-winning economists Case and Deaton found that for the first time in many decades, the US mortality rate was rising among middle-aged adults. And this increase in mortality and morbidity was attributed to, in large part, by the opioid crisis, a crisis that has been termed a disease of despair. And this terminology, disease of despair, is not a coincidence. It actually strikes right at the heart of the pathogenic mechanisms that have produced and continue to maintain this problem. But this term, disease of despair, I think also speaks to a potential solution to this problem. And so to understand that, I want to give you a story from my clinical practice. A patient came to see me for help with chronic pain and opioid-related problems. He had received a series of 5 failed back surgeries, and after each one had been prescribed escalating doses of opioids. He knew he was taking too high of a dose. He knew he had a problem with opioids. But as he so poignantly stated to me, I just don't want to be in pain. I asked him a question that I ask many patients that I've worked with. I asked him to tell me about a time when he wasn't in so much pain, or maybe when he didn't notice his pain very much at all. And he told me that on the weekends when his grandchildren came over and they came into his backyard, he watched them play. And as he watched them play, he became so focused and so absorbed in watching them play that it brought joy to his heart. And in that moment, he didn't notice his pain, nor did he notice any desire for opioids. In that moment, his desire for opioids was temporarily gone. And this clinical anecdote is actually quite common. If you work with people who are struggling with chronic pain and you ask them about this, you may get a similar answer. And even though this is a common clinical anecdote, I think it contains a secret towards building a new therapeutic approach to addressing both chronic pain and addiction. It speaks to a therapeutic mechanism that has not yet been effectively leveraged by psychological interventions. So to understand this claim, we have to understand the role that hedonic dysregulation plays in pain, pleasure, and addiction. In traditional Western philosophy, pleasure and pain have been considered opposites on a hedonic balance, such that increasing experiences of pain are thought to outweigh the pleasure and meaning derived from healthy objects and events in the social environment. Modern neurobiology suggests that pleasure and pain are not mere opposites, but actually are instantiated by a common emotional currency in the brain, mediated by the mesocorticolimbic dopamine circuit and the endogenous opioid system. And these same brain systems are the parts of the brain that become hijacked by addictive drugs through an allostatic process in which increasing sensitization to stress, pain, and drug-related cues comes to outweigh the natural reward derived from healthy objects and events in the social environment. In other words, as the individual becomes more and more dependent on opioids just to feel okay, they become less able to extract a sense of healthy pleasure, joy, and meaning out of life. And this becomes a downward spiral, leading to loss of self-control over opioid use and resulting in opioid dose escalation as a means of obtaining a basic hedonic balance. But of course, this is an ever-losing battle. And so the more the patient takes the drug, the less they are able to make themselves feel good naturally, and they fall into a pit of despair, creating an ever-present hunger for a means of making themselves feel good or feel fulfilled in life. Of course, this downward spiral doesn't happen to everybody who takes opioids. There are plenty of people with chronic pain who can take opioids just as their physicians prescribe them. So one of the research questions that's captivated my interest over the past 10 years is to answer the question, why can some patients take opioids as prescribed, whereas others go on to misuse them or become addicted to them? To answer this question, we use tasks from cognitive neuroscience in my laboratory. One task we use is called the dot probe task. In this task, there's a computer screen and it's split in two. On one side of the screen is a pain-related image, and on the other side of the screen is a neutral image. These images disappear and are replaced by a dot. The participant's task is to choose the side with the dot. So if the dot shows up on the left-hand side of the screen, they hit the left arrow. If it shows up on the right-hand side of the screen, they hit the right arrow. And the computer measures reaction times. It turns out there's a large body of literature to indicate that chronic pain patients are faster to find the dot when it replaces a pain image than when it replaces a neutral image. And this provides an objective index of how much their attention is captured by the pain-related image. In other words, how hyper-focused they are on pain-related information. We also pair neutral images and naturally rewarding positive images. And we pair drug-related images and neutral images. And my research group was the first to demonstrate the presence of a prescription opioid attentional bias among opioid misusers. In other words, patients who misused opioids were faster to find the dot when it replaced a drug picture compared to patients who took opioids just as prescribed by their physician. And importantly, this opioid attentional bias significantly predicted opioid misuse nearly 20 weeks following the end of treatment, suggesting that opioid misusers do exhibit sensitization to opioid-related cues, and that this hyper-focusing of attention on opioids actually drives addictive behavior. In my lab, we also attempt to understand why some patients misuse opioids using a task called the emotion regulation task. In this task, patients are presented with emotional images. In response to the negative emotional images, patients are asked to either pay attention to the image or to try to reappraise the image by reframing the meaning of the content of the image in such a way as to reduce its negative emotional impact. So for example, if you were going to reappraise this image of the mother and child screaming in fear, you might think to yourself, the mother and child faced the tragedy, but in facing the tragedy, it brought them closer together as a family. And if you were to reframe the meaning of this image in this way, it might reduce the negative emotional impact of viewing this image. In response to the positive emotional images, we instruct participants to either pay attention to the image or to savor the image by focusing their attention on the pleasant sensory features of the image and to notice how their mind and body respond as they focus their attention on this pleasant image, so as to increase the enjoyment and reward received from witnessing this positive stimulus. And during this task, we measure various forms of psychophysiology, including heart rate variability, which is the beat-to-beat variation in heart rate that's driven by the parasympathetic nervous system and governed by a higher order network of brain structures involved in regulating attention and emotion. A few years ago, we found that relative to chronic pain patients who take opioids as prescribed, here depicted in these blue bars, opioid misusing chronic pain patients show significant blunting of heart rate variability during reappraisal, viewing positive images, and savoring positive images. In other words, opioid misusers have a difficulty in shifting their emotions in a positive direction. And we find converging evidence in EEG data collected during a similar emotion regulation task. Here on the right, you can see brainwaves from a sample of chronic pain patients who take opioids as prescribed. You can see here they're able to significantly increase their brain response from viewing neutral images to viewing positive images, and from viewing positive images to savoring positive images. On the left, you can see brainwaves from a sample of chronic pain patients who are addicted to prescription opioids. Here you can see complete blunting of brain response while viewing positive emotional images. So in other words, opioid misusers have a blunted capacity to increase healthy positive emotions. And this deficit may have important clinical consequences. So we find that this blunting of brain response to positive emotional experience promotes opioid craving. And it may be driven by functional brain deficits in areas of the brain involved in cognitive control, like the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, as well as parts of the brain that are involved in emotion regulation, like the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, and then of course the striatum, and specifically the structure of the putamen, a brain area responsible for reward processing. So taken together, this neurophysiological data suggests that opioid misusing chronic pain patients exhibit insensitivity to natural reward and an inability to consciously increase or upregulate their positive emotions. In other words, they struggle to make themselves feel better naturally. And because they struggle to make themselves feel better naturally, they fall into a pit of emptiness and despair, a sense of pervasive meaninglessness. And so therefore, again, I think that the term disease of despair that's used to characterize the opioid crisis is not a mere coincidence, but it actually maps pretty closely on to the underlying pathophysiology of this condition. So if this is the problem, if the problem is that people who misuse opioids are unable to make themselves feel better and feel bereft of meaning, then we need a treatment that can actually address this problem. And to that end, I developed mindfulness-oriented recovery enhancement, or MORE, which is an integrated mind-body therapy that unites complementary aspects of mindfulness training, third wave cognitive behavioral therapy, and principles from positive psychology into an intervention to simultaneously address addiction, stress, and chronic pain. MORE is a sequence treatment. It begins with a foundation of mindfulness training, which by virtue of its effects on strengthening attentional control and metacognitive awareness is theorized to enhance more elaborate therapeutic techniques like reappraisal and sabering. And these techniques are introduced later in the therapy. These treatment components are intended to modulate a series of therapeutic mechanisms that are in turn intended to produce clinically significant change in a range of treatment targets relevant to chronic pain and addiction. And I would add here that MORE has been tested in a number of randomized controlled trials as a therapy for a wide range of addictive behaviors, including addiction to opioids, alcohol, other illicit drugs, nicotine addiction, obesity, and even internet addiction. But today my talk is largely going to focus on the effects of MORE on people who are struggling with opioid misuse. MORE is founded on the mindfulness to meaning theory, a temporally dynamic process model of mindful positive emotion regulation that elucidates the downstream cognitive affective mechanisms by which mindfulness promotes human flourishing. This theory asserts that mindfulness facilitates decentering from stressors, including the stressor of chronic pain, into a metacognitive state of awareness that disrupts habitual cognitive schemas and broadens attention to encompass an enlarged set of contextual data from which new adaptive appraisals of the self and the world can be constructed. In other words, when a person is in a negative mental state, their attention becomes constricted upon the negative features of their life, and they begin to link up these features together into durable beliefs that their life is terrible, that the world is awful, or that they're somehow a bad person. The mindfulness to meaning theory posits that mindfulness actually can dissolve these linkages and expand the field of attention so that the person can become aware of parts of their life that they previously were ignoring, the neutral and even positive aspects of their life. And then through the broadened scope of awareness, mindfulness allows the individual to integrate a broadened array of positive and negative features of their life to facilitate a reappraisal of adversity as a source of psychological growth or meaning. In turn, the positive emotions that are stimulated by this mindful reappraisal process can be further amplified through the use of mindfulness to savor the hedonic features and higher order affective meaning of the life situation. And this propels an upward spiral of positive emotions and positive cognition towards the sense of meaningfulness in life. So through this integration of mindfulness, reappraisal, and savoring, Moore aims to modify associative learning mechanisms hijacked during addiction by strengthening top-down cognitive control over bottom-up automatic addictive habits. And specifically, by using cognitive control to restructure reward learning from valuation of drug-related rewards back to valuing natural rewards. Remember, as I described in the allostatic process, when the patient becomes addicted, as the process of addiction develops, the patient becomes increasingly sensitive to drug-related reward and increasingly insensitive to natural reward. The drug compels them more, it starts to take over their life, and they become less able to extract a healthy sense of meaning, pleasure, and joy out of everyday experiences. So here, Moore aims to do the opposite. Moore aims to increase sensitivity to healthy, natural pleasure and joy, to increase the sense of meaningfulness in life. And in doing so, the intention is to reduce sensitivity to drug-related reward and thereby reduce craving and addictive behavior. So I call this my restructuring reward hypothesis. And restructuring reward learning in addiction may be one of the essential pieces of the recovery process. For instance, is a drug craving to be slavishly obeyed, even in the face of adverse consequences to the self and others? Or is the love of one's family more important than the fleeting pleasure of a drug high? These are the sorts of restructuring reward learning processes that may be essential to addiction recovery. In effect, the person in recovery must relearn what is and what is not important in life, and make this sort of fundamental reevaluation of what really matters to them. From a neurobiological perspective, this restructuring reward process may involve strengthening metacognitive attentional control network that involves the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, anterior cingulate, and parietal cortex, and linking these top-down brain structures to restructure associations instantiated in bottom-up limbic and striatal circuitry involved in encoding the emotional habits and associations and reward. So in Moore, we use a mindful savoring technique to foster this restructuring of reward processing. This skill is taught in the fourth session after patients have spent 3 weeks developing basic mindfulness skills. We bring in a bouquet of roses and we ask patients to pick a rose, pick their favorite rose out of the bouquet. And then we guide them to focus mindful attention on the rose, appreciating the pleasant colors, textures, and scents of the flowers, as well as the touch of the petals against their skin. Then, when patients become aware of the arising of positive emotions or positive sensations in the body, we direct them to turn their attention inward and to mindfully savor the inner positive experience, as well as any higher order affective meaning that arises in the encounter with the flowers. And this technique is intended to amplify natural reward processing in the brain, but also to cultivate experiences of meaning and potentially even experiences of self-transcendence, or the sense of being being connected with something greater than the self. The ability of savoring to be a means of cultivating a path towards meaning is illustrated in this quote from Aldous Huxley. Here he says, "I was sitting on the seashore. I looked at a film of sand I had picked up on my hand, when suddenly I saw the exquisite beauty of every little grain of it. Instead of being dull, I saw that each particle was made up of a perfect geometrical pattern with sharp angles, from each of which a brilliant shaft of light was reflected, while each tiny crystal shone like a rainbow. The rays crossed and recrossed, making exquisite patterns of such beauty that they left me breathless. Then suddenly my consciousness was lighted up from within, and I saw in a vivid way how the whole universe was made up of particles of material, which, no matter how dull and lifeless they might seem, were nevertheless filled with this intense and vital beauty." So you can see here in this passage a transition from savoring the purely hedonic qualities of the experience. He's talking about noticing the geometrical pattern, the reflection of the light, the rainbow, so just the visual beauty. But as the experience progresses and deepens, there's an awareness of what this means. There's this experience of cognitive meaning making. And so he comes to realize that the world is beautiful, and even parts of the world that he normally thought were lifeless and dull are filled with this intense and vital beauty. So savoring can be a path from hedonic pleasure to cultivating meaning. But savoring can also be a path towards transcendence. We can think of mindful savoring as a means of heightening phenomenological contact between the subject and the object. Savoring involves the acceptance of the object, and therefore it may be a psychological parallel to the evolutionarily conserved behavior of acceptance wriggles, which is depicted here on the upper right of the screen here, a behavior that mammals exhibit when they curl their tongue to savor an enjoyable sweet taste, or when people or animals caress the skin of a loved one to prolong and intensify reward experience. This sort of physiological acceptance wriggle is known to activate endogenous opioid releasing brain circuitry in brain structures, including the ventral pallidum and other opioidergic hedonic hotspots. So the physical act of savoring sweet food or caressing skin activates opioidergic brain circuitry. But you might think of this form of mindful savoring as a cognitive acceptance wriggle, bringing the pleasant experience into closer psychological contact with the individual. And thus savoring facilitates awareness of the connection between the self and the world, and may elicit experiences of oneness and self-transcendence. As self-transcendence deepens, the process of absorption into the object can yield experiences of bliss, which may be coupled with activation of opioidergic brain circuitry. And as the experience reaches its zenith, ultimately attention may fully disengage from the object and turn back upon itself to savor the blissful field of consciousness beyond the object. And here this notion is described in a commentary from the non-dual Kashmir Shaiva tradition, the Tantric tradition. Changes occasioned in the powers of the senses in contact with the aesthetic object represent a shift of awareness from the surface of consciousness of mundane experience to deeper levels. Here, the fragmentation of the surface is resolved in the fullness of the vibration of I consciousness, in the center of the circle of sensory energies. The senses initially resonate, as it were, in consonance with the aesthetic object, penetrating and mingling with it so completely that the boundary between sensation and appreciative awareness dissolves away, leaving a state of unity which pervades the senses and the aesthetic object. This leads to a heightened state of introversion in which the aesthetic object is experienced with such intimacy and sense of direct contact that it's no longer felt to be external. It is submerged in the field of awareness, filling it so completely with aesthetic delight it arouses that the subject loses all sense of his individuality. Consciousness, now freed from the restrictions of the narrow confines of individual subjectivity, spontaneously expands to finally delight in the untrammeled outpouring of its own pulsation as the pure, appreciative subjectivity. So in other words, savoring affords us contact with the object. And as the contact deepens, our connection with the object becomes so intimate that the distinction between the subject and the object begins to melt away. At first, there's a sense of oneness, a blissful oneness with the object, but eventually the experience deepens until the subject and the object may be completely transcended. And thus, the upward spiral of mindfulness to meaning may produce experiences of oneness with the savored object, and ultimately to experiences of non-duality and self-transcendence. Although such experiences are thought to be only accessible to the most advanced meditative practitioners, my colleagues and I have conducted psychometric research over the past few years that actually demonstrates the opposite. What we're learning is that these experiences are actually quite accessible even to people who are relatively new with meditation. So we developed a tool called the Non-Dual Awareness Dimensional Assessment. It's a multi-item questionnaire, but the dimensions of transcendence assessed are illustrated in these 3 items here. There are items that relate to the notion of annihilational transcendence, so the sense of the self dissolving. Other items on the nada are related to the concept of relational transcendence, or the oneness between the self and the world. And finally, there are several items on the nada that tap into the affective bliss that accompanies these experiences, such as the experience of being filled with blissful warmth or energy when one experiences this sense of oneness. We find that over 50% of a general population sample report experiencing these types of self-transcendent experiences at least some of the time. But we also find that mindfulness training interventions can increase self-transcendence as measured by the nada. So here you can see data from a sample of 60 veterans with chronic pain who were treated with long-term opioids. We brought them into the lab. We asked them to practice mindfulness, and we assessed state self-transcendence and found that 8 weeks of mindfulness-oriented recovery enhancement significantly increased the propensity to experience self-transcendence during meditation. We've also developed pictorial measures to try to capture dimensions of self-transcendence, including the experience of the autoscopic projection of consciousness into space. And this concept is alluded to in many different contemplative traditions. So for example, in the Tibetan Mahamudra tradition, this concept is known as the unity of space and awareness. And it's also depicted in tankas and mandalas, such as these below, in which the meditator's consciousness is shown to expand into halos of energy or broaden into concentric circles constituting the universe. And again, we think of these experiences as only happening to the most advanced meditative adepts, but actually we did a study in college students and taught them basic mindful breathing meditation and found that a basic 15-minute mindful breathing intervention could increase the sense of one's consciousness or self expanding into the universe. So I want to come down from the clouds here. Now I hope this was a fun part of the story that I told you. And this theory really lays the foundation for understanding how mindfulness-oriented recovery enhancement might be a useful tool for helping us to treat addiction, stress, and chronic pain. But to assess this, we really need to use the most rigorous methods of clinical science. And so to that end, I've spent more than a decade conducting randomized controlled trials of the MORE intervention. So I'm going to begin with the first study, which was an NIH-funded randomized controlled trial of MORE as a treatment for prescription opioid misuse. In this study, 115 chronic pain patients who had been taking prescription opioids for more than 10 years were randomly assigned to receive 8 weeks of MORE or 8 weeks of a supportive psychotherapy control condition. At baseline, nearly 3/4 of the sample reported misusing opioids, and there were high rates of psychiatric comorbidity, so the usual suspects of depression, anxiety, and PTSD. And the majority of the sample were from a low socioeconomic strata. In summary of the findings, we found that MORE significantly reduced chronic pain symptoms. So it significantly reduced pain-related severity and significantly reduced pain-related functional interference. And these effects were maintained by the 3-month follow-up point. Pain interference measures to what extent pain interferes with a person's general activity level, their mood, their walking ability, their normal work, their relationships, their sleep, and their enjoyment of life. So MORE not only decreased the intensity of chronic pain, but it also decreased the extent to which pain was interfering with a person's ability to live a meaningful life. And we found that MORE significantly reduced opioid craving. And the effect of MORE on opioid craving remained significant even after controlling for the effects of MORE on pain. So it wasn't just that MORE was reducing desire for opioids because people were in less pain. It was actually directly reducing the appetitive impulse towards opioids. But most importantly, we found that MORE significantly reduced opioid misuse. There was a 63% reduction in opioid misuse in the MORE group compared to a 32% reduction in the support group. And I would point out here that these data show that our control condition used in this study was indeed an active treatment. It reduced opioid misuse by 32%, but MORE was mo better. And I apologize for my really cheesy joke, but I got to lighten it up a bit after talking about the primordial bliss of consciousness. With regard to measuring the effects of MORE on hedonic regulation, we used the dot probe task that I mentioned earlier. And we found the first evidence in the scientific literature that a mindfulness-based treatment can significantly reduce the pain attentional bias in a randomized controlled trial. So in other words, after 8 weeks of treatment with MORE, patients' attention was less hyperfixated on pain-related information. We also found that among patients with an opioid attentional bias, MORE significantly reduced the opioid attentional bias. So after 8 weeks of treatment with MORE, patients' attention was less fixated on opioid-related cues. But some of the most interesting data from this study came from heart rate data collected during the dot probe task. And you don't really need to know much about statistics to see that something very dramatic is happening here. So the changes in heart rate in the MORE group are depicted in the blue bars, and the changes in heart rate in the support group are depicted in the red bars. And here you can see that across all 3 conditions of the dot probe task, participants in MORE exhibited significantly greater heart rate decelerations than patients in the support group. We asked patients to report their responses to these cues to try to get a better sense of what these changes in heart rate meant. And we found that, not surprisingly, that heart rate decelerations in response to the opioid and the pain-related cues were associated with reports of decreased arousal. Patients who showed the largest heart rate slowing felt the less stimulated, the less aroused by those cues. That makes perfect sense. But we found the opposite pattern in response to the pleasure photos. Patients whose hearts showed the greatest degree of slowing in response to viewing the pleasurable photos reported being the most stimulated, the most aroused by those pleasurable images. And so we took this to mean that perhaps more was increasing physiological sensitivity to natural pleasure. We conducted a heart rate variability analysis and found that across the board, more led to significantly greater increases in heart rate variability than the control group. But these effects were most pronounced in response to the pleasure cue condition. So by now you should be wondering, well, who cares about this psychophysiology stuff? You know, what does this even mean clinically? Well, it turns out it means a whole lot. We conducted a multivariate path analysis and found that the effects of more on reducing opioid craving were statistically mediated by changing the heart rate response to the pleasure cue condition, not by changing the heart rate response to the opioid cue condition. In other words, more appeared to be decreasing opioid craving by enhancing physiological responsivity to natural pleasure. And this represented the most profound scientific finding of my career to that point. And if you understand addiction science, I think you can begin to see why. Again, remember, one of the most prominent models of addiction, the allostatic model of addiction, states that as the person becomes more addicted over time, they become increasingly sensitive to drug-related cues, and they become increasingly insensitive to the pleasure derived from natural, healthy objects in the social environment. Here, these data suggest that the opposite may be possible, that potentially, by increasing sensitivity to healthy natural pleasure, this may reduce the pull of drugs and thereby decrease craving and addictive behavior. And I think this finding and the findings that followed really are so important and so seminal that it really was one of the key factors leading to the funding of more than $25 million in federally funded research grants. It's a big deal. We found converging evidence for this idea in EEG data collected during an affective picture viewing task, where we found that more significantly increased the brain response measured by the EEG and one particular component called the late positive potential of the EEG while patients were viewing naturally rewarding images. And this increase in brain responsivity to natural pleasure was correlated with reduced opioid craving and also reduced pain severity, suggesting that increasing physiological responsiveness to natural reward not only might reduce the addictive tendency, but also might be involved in mindfulness-based analgesia. We also asked patients to keep a fine-grained account of their moment-to-moment experience throughout the study. So patients were asked to rate their pain levels and their mood state up to 4 times a day over the course of the treatment. So this gives you a tremendous amount of data, in this case, 224 data points for each participant over the course of the study. And we found that more significantly decreased pain intensity from moment to moment. We also found that more significantly increased positive emotions from moment to moment. In fact, patients in MORE were 2.75 times more likely than patients in the control group to exhibit positive emotion regulation, which we defined as if you're in a bad mood in one moment, being able to put yourself in a good mood in the next moment. Or if you're in a positive mood in this moment, being able to preserve your positive mood in the next moment. Patients treated with MORE were 2.75 times as likely as those in the control group to be positively, affectively regulated over the course of therapy. What was really interesting about that was that it wasn't the changes in pain from moment to moment that predicted decreases in opioid misuse, but rather it was that increasing positive emotions from moment to moment predicted decreases in opioid misuse. So to the extent that MORE enabled patients to keep themselves in a positive mood or to increase positive mood, that explained the effect of more on reducing opioid misuse. And so those are the findings from the first study on more, first randomized controlled trial in this population of prescription opioid misusing chronic pain patients. But more recently, we replicated these findings in a second randomized controlled trial conducted in a number of primary care clinics in Salt Lake City. In this study, 95 opioid-treated chronic pain patients were randomly assigned to receive 8 weeks of more or 8 weeks of a supportive psychotherapy control condition. And again, we found that more significantly reduced chronic pain severity and significantly reduced opioid misuse compared to the control condition. But we also, in this study, focused on the effects of more on positive psychological experience, and in particular, in many of the constructs that are involved in the mindfulness to meaning theory. And we found that more significantly increased positive emotions, savoring, meaning in life, and the sense of self-transcendence. Importantly, More's effects on increasing these positive psychological functions were linked with decreases in pain severity and decreases in opioid misuse, suggesting that more may reduce opioid misuse and chronic pain by treating the disease of despair, giving people an ability to naturally increase their sense of joy, healthy pleasure, and meaning in life, including self-transcendent meaning in life. We were really excited by these findings. Again, first of all, because our common sense understanding of these things is that increasing the sense of self-transcendence is only something that happens to the most adept meditation practitioners. And here we showed it in a sample of people suffering from chronic pain who were also at risk for misusing opioids. But even more exciting was the fact that these increases in the sense of self-transcendence had very important clinical consequences. As to the extent to which patients learn to achieve a sense of oneness or a sense of transcendence of the self through the mindfulness training taught in More, this explained to some degree the amount of pain relief they achieved. It explained to a significant degree the amount of decrease in addictive behavior they would exhibit. And so I think these are probably the first results in the scientific literature to show that experiences of self-transcendence have important clinical consequences. But we're also interested in measuring this increase in natural reward experience using other measures, including this pictorial measure that we call the sensation mannequin, or the body map. In this task, participants are asked to depict where in the body they experience pleasant and unpleasant sensations. So we give them a body map, which consists of 369 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter pixels. And they have to click on each pixel to draw on the body where they feel pleasant and unpleasant sensations. Unpleasant sensations are represented in red. Pleasant sensations are represented in blue. The density of the hue indicates the frequency with which a given part of the body was identified as pleasant or unpleasant by the participants. Here you can see on the top row patients in the supportive psychotherapy control group. You can see there was little change in positive sensations. Here in the bottom you can see patients in the mindfulness-oriented recovery enhancement therapy. You can see they experienced a massive increase in pleasant sensations throughout the body. More not only increased pleasant sensations, it also shifted the ratio of pleasant to unpleasant sensations. So before treatment, patients reported experiencing about 1 pleasant sensation for every 3 unpleasant sensations. So their experience of their bodies was decidedly unpleasant. It was characterized by displeasure and anguish. Following 8 weeks of treatment with More, patients reported nearly 2 pleasant sensations for every 1 unpleasant sensation, suggesting that More taught patients how to cultivate a natural inner sense of reward in the form of embodied pleasure. And so we were really excited about these findings and thought that if more was producing such internal reward and positive emotional experience, that it might also be decreasing the demand for opioids. And so we looked at that, and in fact, more did decrease opioid dosing. So these are new data that were just published in the journal American Psychologist. They should be coming out later this year, showing that more significantly reduces opioid dosing compared to the control group. There's about a 30% reduction in opioid dose among patients treated with more. And we found that more was reducing opioid dosing by increasing heart rate variability during meditation. So we brought patients into the lab and we asked them to practice mindfulness meditation. We gave them very nondescript instructions before the 8 weeks of the study treatments and then after the 8-week study treatments. And we found that patients who received more were able to significantly increase their heart rate variability while practicing mindfulness. And this increase in heart rate variability while practicing mindfulness statistically mediated the effect of more on reducing opioid dose. What does this mean? Well, we know from a large body of basic science research that heart rate variability is linked with the capacity to self-regulate one's emotion, attention, and autonomic response. So there was a classical experiment conducted by Segerstrom and Ness in 2007 in which participants were given a tray of food, and on one side of the tray was a pile of delicious chocolate chip cookies, and on the other side of the tray was a pile of carrots. And in one condition, the participants were asked to allow themselves to eat the cookies, whereas in the other condition, they were asked to ignore the cookies and eat the carrots instead. Patients who had to show self-control and not eat the delicious chocolate chip cookies, but instead eat the carrots, showed significant increases in heart rate variability. So heart rate variability may index the capacity to exert self-control over craving. And so potentially that's what we're seeing here in these results, showing that the effect of more on reducing opioid dose is mediated by increases in heart rate variability during meditation. In other words, we might think of meditation as a self-regulatory technique that allows us to cope with craving. And this brings us to relatively new neurophysiological data on the effects of more on brain responses while viewing opioid-related cues. So if more is increasing the capacity to exert self-control and self-regulation during meditation, might it also be enhancing the ability to self-regulate addictive responses when directly facing the addictive trigger? So to answer this question, we used a cue reactivity task, very simple task. We showed patients images of opioids and neutral images while we measured their brain response. And we found that more significantly decreased the late positive potential of the EEG while patients were viewing opioid-related images. So let me walk you through these data if you're not used to looking at ERP data. So here in red is the brain's response while the patient is viewing the opioid-related cue. And here in gray is the brain response while the patient is viewing neutral images. So you can see that before treatment, the patient's brain was hyperactive in response to viewing the opioid-related cue compared to viewing the neutral cue. The blue line is the brain's response following 8 weeks of treatment with more. So there was a significant decrease in the brain's responsivity to viewing the opioid cues. And here on the right are brain waves from the control group. You can see there's no difference between pre and post while viewing the opioid cue. Both before and after treatment, patients in the control group, their brains remained hyperactive in response to the drug-related cue. And if you still have trouble seeing these effects, here's a bar chart of the effect. And you can see that more produced a pretty large decrease in brain reactivity during viewing of drug-related cues. And this is, to my knowledge, the first evidence from a randomized controlled trial that a mindfulness-based intervention can reduce drug cue reactivity in the brain. But we also found that Moore significantly increased neurophysiological responses during savoring. So Moore was decreasing the brain's response to drug-related cues, but increasing the brain's response to savoring natural, healthy rewards. And here's the bar chart demonstrating this effect. So again, in line with the restructuring reward hypothesis, by increasing responsivity to natural reward, this may decrease the pull of drug-related reward and thereby reduce craving and addictive behavior. And we have new data suggesting that the same process is happening. This is a replication in a second data set. Here is ERPs, again, EEG brain response in a sample of opioid-treated veterans. And you can see here on the left are brain responses while viewing natural reward cues. And then here on the right are ERPs during savoring of natural reward cues. In both conditions, Moore is significantly increasing brain activity while the patient is viewing natural reward. So here we have multiple replications across a number of different measures, from cardiac autonomic measures to self-report measures and even neurophysiological measures, demonstrating that mindfulness-oriented recovery enhancement can increase physiological responsivity to natural pleasure. And in doing so, this may help restructure reward processing and decrease the addictive tendency. And we find converging evidence in simple self-report data. We showed patients natural rewarding images and asked them to rate their positive emotional response. And we found that after 8 weeks of Moore, patients reported when they viewed images of smiling babies, beautiful mountains, lovers holding hands, that it made them happier. And that this increase in positive emotional response mediated the effect of Moore on reducing opioid misuse. So again, further evidence that we can restructure reward processing by shifting the valuing of drug-related rewards back to the valuing of natural rewards. And this will in turn reduce craving and addictive behavior. And I've been showing you all this data in people who misuse opioids, but we found similar patterns of data in people struggling with other addictive behaviors. Here's some fMRI data from a sample of smokers who participated in Moore relative to a comparison group who did not receive Moore. And here on the left, you can see decreases in activity in the brain reward system, notably structures like the orbital frontal cortex and the ventral striatum, while patients are viewing cigarette cues. There's a decrease in reward-related activity during the viewing of the drug cue. On the right here, you can see the opposite effect. There's a significant increase in brain response during viewing and savoring of natural reward cues in patients treated with Moore. And we find that this increase in brain responsivity during savoring was associated with decreased smoking. So it seems that this process of restructuring reward processing is incredibly important in the treatment of addiction and maybe a key therapeutic mechanism by which Moore is exerting its clinical effects. And now this is moving us to some of the newest mechanistic data. These are data that we just developed in the past couple of months. These data were taken from a randomized controlled trial of Moore as a treatment for opioid misuse and chronic pain among veterans. And here we asked patients to come into the lab and practice mindfulness. And we measured EEG responses during mindfulness practice. We found that following treatment with Moore, patients exhibited significant increases in alpha and theta spectral power, particularly in the frontal and frontocentral electrodes, here depicted in the lower left part of the slide. We also found that more significantly increased functional connectivity, or EEG coherence, in particular in the frontal midline electrodes in theta frequencies. What's interesting about this is, and I'm sure Dr. Kahn knows far more about this than me and probably any of the rest of us, as he's a renowned expert in EEG as a measure of meditative states. But one of the classical findings across the literature in novices and also advanced meditators, but in healthy populations, is that mindfulness and other meditation techniques increase frontal midline theta activity. Here we're showing this effect in a sample of opioid-treated veterans who were totally naive to meditation before this study. And we find that in this data set, again, that more significantly decreases opioid dosing over time relative to the control group. But what was so exciting to us is that the effects of more on reducing opioid dose were statistically mediated by increasing frontal theta power. And germane to our topic that we discussed earlier, in terms of the bridge from hedonic pleasure to self-transcendent meaning, we found that increases in frontal theta power were actually correlated with another facet of self-transcendence, and that is the sense of one's body boundary fading or beginning to dissolve. We found that patients who reported the largest increases in frontal theta power during mindfulness meditation reported greater experiences of the boundary of their bodies beginning to fade and dissolve as their sense of self began to expand into the universe. So again, amplifying frontal theta activity during mindfulness meditation, which is associated with self-transcendence, was linked with decreased opioid dosing in this sample of opioid-treated veterans. But we also have converging evidence of this in a much larger sample of opioid-treated civilians. We find that increases in frontal midline theta coherence during meditation is associated with increases in self-transcendence and bliss as measured by the NADA, and mediate the effect of more on reducing opioid misuse by follow-up. So when we get these types of replications in the mindfulness field, it's incredibly exciting to me. So few of our studies have been replicated. And so when we show this phenomena multiple times across multiple samples with multiple measurement approaches, it really begins to suggest that we're starting to hone in on something that could be considered a pragmatic truth. And that is teaching people how to transcend their limited sense of self, to tap into something greater than the self, can be a potential source of reward and meaning. And this isn't just mere happiness, but it has profound therapeutic consequences. It's a pathway that enables people to find internally generated reward so they don't have to seek it outside of themselves. And therefore, they can become less dependent on drugs as a way of feeling okay. And so lastly, I wanted to offer a couple of more compelling clinical findings that speak, I think, to both the extension of this therapy into other populations, as well as its efficacy. So we conducted an NIH-funded pilot randomized controlled trial of more as a treatment for people with opioid use disorder who are receiving methadone maintenance therapy. And we found that more significantly reduced heroin use and illicit drug use. This is in a sample of primarily African-American and Latino people living in the inner city. This study was conducted at Rutgers in New Brunswick, New Jersey. And so these folks really were living pretty rough lives and from a very low SES with a low education level, and they still seem to benefit to a great degree from learning these skills. And not only did MORE reduce drug use in this population, but it also reduced chronic pain symptoms and emotional distress. And we used ecological momentary assessment like we did in our earlier trial. And among the findings, we found that MORE significantly reduced craving from moment to moment. In fact, there was a 50% reduction in the intensity of craving in patients treated with MORE relative to people who received methadone maintenance as usual. Germane to Dr. Kahn's interests and relative to the core theoretical construct here, we find that MORE enhances the trait proclivity to experience self-transcendence, and that patients become more able and more likely to experience the sense of oneness with the universe, more likely to experience the sense of their self dissolving and experience a sense of bliss and love and connectedness with the world around them, and that this effect is maintained 9 months after the end of the therapy, suggesting indeed that MORE may stimulate an upward spiral of mindfulness to meaning that ultimately results in connection with something greater than the self. And we're just beginning to learn about the therapeutic power of this process. But we believe that teaching people how to cultivate a healthy sense of pleasure, joy, and transcendent meaning in life may come to outweigh the pull of drug-related reward and thereby decrease addictive behavior. So in conclusion, the downward spiral of chronic pain, opioid misuse, and addiction appears to be fueled by hedonic dysregulation, marked by an inability to cultivate and savor healthy pleasure, joy, and meaning in life. MORE is an efficacious treatment for opioid misuse and chronic pain, as revealed by 4 distinct randomized controlled trials involving a total of 500 patients. Currently, there's a $25 million research program and 3 additional randomized controlled trials underway that involve 1,250 participants. So over the next 5 years, we're going to be learning a lot more about this. Sorry for the bad pun. MORE may treat and prevent opioid misuse and addiction by reducing drug cue reactivity, increasing hedonic regulation, enhancing meaning in life, and eliciting self-transcendence. And ultimately, teaching people how to take in the good and mindfully savor natural, healthy pleasure may provide the learning signal needed to restore adaptive hedonic regulation and ultimately reverse the addictive process. And I know that's a bold claim, but we're facing a serious crisis and we need bold solutions. So thank you for your attention. And thanks, Dr. Kahn, for this wonderful invitation to present these data.
Oh, you're quite welcome. Thank you. This was really great. What a tour de force. So I'd like to open up the floor now. We have about 15 minutes for some question and answer period here. And for those who are not familiar, there's a way to raise your hand by clicking on the participants. On the bottom of the screen, there's a series of tabs: security, participants, polls, share screen. So if you go on participants, and then you see a list of all the participants that are here, and you can see at the bottom there's some additional tabs. One says more. Interestingly enough, it's called more. Next to the yes, the no. So there's a more, 3 little bars in a gray circle. If you click on that, there's this opportunity to raise your hand, do a thumbs up or a thumbs down. There are other ways to do like a reaction. You can raise your hand, thumbs up, or clap, thumbs up. But if we see you doing any of those reactions, we'll have you have a question. So I see somebody has something, Indi Roshi Singh. So we'll go to this one first.
All right. Hello. Hey, guys. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Eric. That was amazing. Thank you for your work. Thanks for doing the practice yourself. It seems that, being on that lake, what a beautiful space you have behind you to, meditate yourself. So thank you for practicing it. My question is kind of related to, so I've recently started teaching meditation with police officers at a couple of different police stations in the Bay Area. And I found it challenging to, get it into those spaces. I've had to be a little bit of an artist in how I speak to them. And I wonder, Eric, have you had these struggles like with doing this work and like bringing it into spaces, especially like rehab centers where sometimes they don't want to make things better? I mean, I don't want to get into the politics of that, but have you had any troubles, and do you have any advice for bringing this practice and maybe bringing more into more spaces around our country?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's really important to adopt the language and the metaphors of the people that you're trying to teach. And so, for example, if you're teaching police, then I'd try to sell the concept of mindfulness in terms of the language and metaphors that matter to them. So, for example, I might present, if I was going to teach meditation to police or first responders, I might couch it as a form of mental training, or, weightlifting for your mind, or a way to enhance mental toughness. I might use language like that, whereas I might use very different language if I was teaching to, a yoga class, for example. So I think just the general concept, I can't give you specific advice, but the general concept of changing the way you talk about what meditation is and what it does, and the actual meditation instructions to match the culture of the people that you're working with.
Yeah. That gets into an interesting side question, I think, which I'd like to hear your opinion on as well. What about the danger of adapting mindfulness to be just whatever somebody wants it to be? So, get rich with mindfulness, be a more effective, day trader with mindfulness, whatever it is. There is this trend, which you're quite aware of, as are all of us in the mindfulness field, that some people have called the McMindfulness effect or what have you, but that, if mindfulness is all things to all people, then what good is it really? Does it start to become meaningless and also possibly at odds with some of its original intended goals?
Yeah, good point. Good point. I mean, not only meaningless, but actually potentially harmful against the values that originally drove these traditions. I mean, there's a lot I could say about it. What I want to say right now really is building on Indy's comment, and this relates to something we've had to learn, which is that the way that we debrief mindfulness experience is absolutely crucial to its therapeutic effects, especially in these populations of people struggling with addiction. It makes all the difference in the world. So it's not just the script of the meditation instruction itself, but also how you process the patient's experience, what you reinforce, what you don't reinforce, how you shape their responses, how you relate to them, and how you reframe the patient's experience into the concepts that you're trying to teach. All of that becomes really, really important. And actually, I spend a lot when I'm teaching clinicians how to do more. We spend most of the 2-day training on practicing how to debrief the experience, because it's so crucial. And so to your point, Raul, we start with really this attitude of almost like anything goes. In the beginning, we try to reframe whatever the patient tells us is happening in their mind as evidence of mindfulness practice. And this is really important to build buy-in and motivation. We give them a lot of positive reinforcement so they feel like they're doing it right. Because once the patient thinks they're not doing it right, they start to think they can't practice mindfulness or it's not going to work from them. Then you've lost them. They're done. But as they begin to feel more self-efficacious and they get a sense like I really can do this, then we spend more time really guiding and shaping their responses in the direction of what is, for lack of a better term, right mindfulness. So I think there's a delicate balance there, so stepping back to the broader societal question, I think there's some value in presenting a more open definition that helps to allow many people to connect with mindfulness. But that's the beginning, not the end, right? Then we have a responsibility to help guide people towards a more just and virtuous society.
Yeah, thanks for that. I have a couple of additional questions waiting for you. One is from Dr. Jordan Davis, who's one of our key faculty members here, who has a history of investigating mindfulness-based approaches for addiction, like yourself, and is working with a number of the rest of us in the faculty here, developing further studies along that direction. So Jordan, please go ahead.
Yeah, hey Eric, how's it going? Thanks for this great talk. I'm really excited to see those new results too. I know you were anxiously awaiting to get those data analyzed. So this is a selfish question, but what do you know about the effects of more, especially among the veteran population, for those with comorbidity such as PTSD, depression, anxiety disorders, because there's not a whole lot out there on comorbidity results. So I feel like you probably have the data to look at it.
Yeah, good to see you, Jordan, and good to hear your voice. So we have data on that, and in fact, with the new trial finishing in the civilians, we have clear effects of more on reducing symptoms of depression and PTSD, which is pretty exciting since we know these things fuel addictive behavior. In the veterans, we don't know yet. That trial is not done, so we won't know for a while. But what's really interesting about this is that these effects at least on PTSD are a replication of an earlier effect that I found in a randomized controlled trial that I published in 2016 in Behavior Research and Therapy, showing that more reduced PTSD symptoms in people with co-occurring disorders and addictive behaviors. And so I'm kind of biased because my training as a psychotherapist tells me that we need to directly deal with trauma. We need to teach patients how to directly address the traumatic memories, whether it's through prolonged exposure type of approaches or cognitive processing therapies. My training is people need to delve into the trauma and work through it to overcome it. But actually, these data suggest otherwise, against my assumption, which is that you don't even have to necessarily directly address the trauma, but that by giving people these general mindfulness-related skills, these may be reducing PTSD symptoms. And so I'm quite surprised by that. I still think we can do better. And I know you and I have had this conversation before. I think we need to advance new mindfulness therapies that actually unite mindfulness training with directly restructuring memories associated with the trauma. And, we have some colleagues who are working on things like that. The person who comes to mind is Tony King, the University of Michigan, is doing great work in this area. But nevertheless, it's exciting to me that just teaching people these general self-regulatory skills seems to help alleviate depression and trauma in this population.
Great, thanks for that. And we have another waiting question from Grace Bell.
Well, for me, hi everybody. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Oh, this is wonderful. The thank you for all this beautiful research. It's really compelling. I'm an addictions nurse, and I have been working in the field of medication-assisted treatment and addictions care for more than 20 years. And I'm also I've been a practitioner of mindfulness since 1973, probably before many of you were born. So I know the benefits. And I'm very curious all the time about how to best utilize mindfulness, especially in early recovery. And also really interested in that whole trauma component, because I worked with the veterans in opioid treatment programs for quite a few years, and we utilized mindfulness. And there's some very specific things that we learned, that, some things were more activating. The basic self-regulating skills that mindfulness can get started very early, like within a few days of recovery. But also I'm very interested in more as how it would be integrated in a clinical setting in the groups. Our groups always started with 5 minutes of mindfulness that became very, very valued by our patients, universally valued. But the attention span is small at the beginning. So utilizing that 5 minutes to not only teach a technique that they can walk out of the building with, but also to give them the educational information. This is what happens to me, kind of things. I'm really interested in the integration of your work and of more in a busy clinical setting.
Well, thanks for asking about that, and I'm interested in that too. We'll see how it works out. The model that we've studied is most recently is offering more in doctors' offices, but it's not really part of the standard clinic flow. So we had these groups, they were scheduled. We actually used whatever space was available. So if there was a conference room available, we would use it. If there was like a lunchroom where the doctors and nurses would eat lunch, we used that space. And the groups were held really any time of day, either late morning, afternoon, early evening. And they were 2 hours long. And like you, I think your clinical intuition is right on. I mean, you have to start with a small amount of mindfulness practice and then titrate people up as their attention strengthens and as they can tolerate silence for longer and longer periods. So we start with a relatively brief mindfulness meditation in the first session, about 10 minutes, and then it increases all the way up to about 40 minutes in the 8th session. But I'm also really interested, like you're saying, in how more could be integrated into the clinic flow, and I think that's probably the next step. Now that it's really shown without much of a doubt that more is efficacious as a treatment for opioid misuse, we need to now understand how best to integrate it and implement it in everyday practice. And so I want to do a future study where more is being delivered by physicians and nurses, by providers who can actually get insurance reimbursement for the therapy, and then figure out the best way to deliver it as part of the busy clinic flow. So it's an exciting new challenge.
Yeah, it is indeed the challenge we all face in putting our work in mindfulness into the practical realities of healthcare in America. Interestingly, as you probably know, healthcare in Europe, it's already more integrated because of the clear savings in healthcare dollars that these kind of approaches provide for people struggling with various mental illness.
It's kind of sad because there's increasing pressure to make everything more and more brief. Can you do it in 3 sessions? Can you do it in 1 session? Can you do it in 10 minutes, 5 minutes? Can you deliver it with an app?
Right.
And I want to say yes, but my clinical intuition says no. And especially when you're dealing with people who are struggling with the complex intersecting comorbidities of chronic pain, addictive behavior, and mental health disorders. And these things all hang together. You know, those are really complex forms of human suffering. And I don't think that we can take a McMindfulness approach and give somebody an app where they practice something 5 minutes a day and it's gonna heal them from that depth of suffering. In fact, quite the opposite. I actually think the 8-week intervention model is not long enough. And I'm really curious what happens when you give somebody a year of mindfulness training, or 2 years, or 3 years. But of course, you know, that's not what the funding realities don't necessarily support that. But if you think about it from a basic health perspective, if I were to exercise or adopt a healthy diet for 8 weeks and that's it, would that really lead to long-term lasting health benefits for me? Wouldn't I have to do this as a daily practice every day for years to make a fundamental change to my health and mental health? So I think that, you know, we're studying mindfulness in these increasingly brief periods and packages. And I think that's necessary due to their current healthcare realities. But I think for long-term transformation, you know, we really need something much more.
Yeah, agreed. So we should start wrapping it up. I'll just make two final points before saying goodbye to everyone, and thank you all for being with us today. One is just for you personally, Eric. I think you're aware of this, but you mentioned at one point that these findings were the first scientific findings linking that experience of self-transcendence specifically to clinical outcomes. And while I think you're right, in the mindfulness literature, it's really just hasn't been explored yet. And I think there are a number of reasons for that in terms of the legitimization of the field, you know, trajectory. But it is of note, and just in case you weren't aware, a number of the investigators who are now looking at psychedelic psychotherapy have found exactly that same association, the degree of that self-transcendent experience during the psychedelic therapy session being really clearly linked to outcomes, both in terms of reduced drug behaviors and improvements in depression symptoms and PTSD symptoms. So some interesting overlaps between these two fields, which
Definitely.
I know you're interested in as well. And then I'll just say a note for everyone, you know, we are going to continue the USC Center for Mindfulness Science to host some of these virtual events during the COVID restriction times. And if you haven't visited our website to sign up directly to get our listserv, you can find mindfulscience.usc.edu. And we will also endeavor to make this forum available on our talks once we're doing them in person on campus again, just so more people can tune in. Dr. Garland, thank you so much for being with us today and for your really innovative and path-breaking work. Looking forward to seeing where you go next.
Thank
It was
you.
great fun. Thanks to everybody.
Everyone, take care.
Thanks.
Thank you.